thank you for being with us. We have an exciting day ahead. I am Director of Langham Publishing, which is the publishing arm of Langham Partnership, which seeks to equip Christians around the world with resources to live and to lead within the church around the world. We also have a passion to equip Christians in academia. So it was a perfect partnership when we started with the Global Faculty Initiative to publish a series of discussions from Christians from various disciplines. And the first volume in the Global Faculty Initiative series was Justice and Rights, Nicholas Wolterstorff in dialogue with the university. And today that's exactly the topic that we'll be talking about. I'm very pleased to pass over to our leader of the webinar today, President of the Global Faculty Initiative and co-editor of the GFI series, Terence Halliday. Terry, please take it away.
Good morning to those of you who are joining us from the Americas. Good afternoon to those in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And good evening to those of you in Asia and Oceania. Let me add my welcome to this webinar on the first book in GFI series with Langham, Cross-Disciplinary Encounters with Theology. The Global Faculty Initiative is a network of 190 professors, principally in research universities on 6 continents. And our mission is to bring Christian thought deeply into the heart of Christian scholarship and into academic institutions by equipping scholars like me to think Christianly about every aspect of our academic vocations. GFI has a distinctive method, and that method is to host dialogues on faith and scholarship. Each dialogue centers on a great theme of our faith, a theme that readily can be discussed inside any secular university in the world. We were greatly privileged to launch our first dialogue on justice and rights with Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff. And so this book, Justice and Rights, Nicholas Wolterstorff in Dialogue with the University, is the culmination of our first discussion and conversation together. What is it that makes this book quite different from the conventional academic books that Professor Yo and I have edited in the past? Perhaps preeminently, it's because it reaches inside the heart of the university with a different genre of academic book publishing. It's structured as a conversation between Nicholas Wolterstorff and dozens of scholars in diverse disciplines. Professor Wolterstorff wrote a short preview and then a longer theology brief, which form the part 1 and part 2 of this book. And then 55 scholars from 38 universities entered into conversation with Professor Wolterstorff. Some wrote just a paragraph or two, others wrote short notes, a page or two, and others wrote longer reflections, which we call disciplinary briefs. The book curates and crafts all these into a series of chapters on theology, on law and society, on global justice, on biological and physical and medical sciences, and not least on justice in the academy. The book concludes with a brilliant postscript by Professor Wolterstorff. This book tackles the headline issues of our time: COVID and pandemics, racial discrimination, war, climate change, refugees and displaced persons, international aid, injustice in the past, environmental justice, sexual violence, biomedicine, natural science, public health, mental health, and much else. And not least, it delves deeply into the practices of the academic life itself. Today's webinar has 3 segments. In a moment, Dr. Willis will enter into a conversation with Professor Wolterstorff. This will be followed by a panel discussion, which I will convene, and we'll conclude the webinar with questions and answers led by Dr. Willis. It's now our honor to hear from Professor Wolterstorff, Emeritus Professor, Yale University, and the Reverend Dr. Bethan Willis, Chaplain of the Oxford Pastorate, which is a Christian mission to the University of Oxford since the late 1800s and a close partner of the Global Faculty Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to interview Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff again now. We've had this conversation a few times now, haven't we? And it's always a delight. And I think one of the things that I particularly enjoy in speaking to you is just getting kind of under the bonnet, I suppose, of where this theology brief came from, and your own journey into thinking deeply about questions of justice. And so I wonder if we can begin there for our audience today and just hear a little bit about how you came to take these questions of justice so seriously and centrally within your own research.
It was because of experiences that came my way. I'm a philosopher, and over the past 40 years, about 40 years ago, maybe 50, philosopher at Harvard, John Rawls, published a book on justice, theory of justice. That spurred commentaries and commentaries on commentaries and commentaries on the commentaries on comment. You can't believe the discussion that it spawned. I knew about that, read some of it, found it boring because it was all internal, philosophers talking to each other about what they or some other philosopher had said. So didn't pay much attention to it. Then my college sent me in September 1978 to a conference in Potchefstroom, South Africa. It was not about apartheid. Apartheid was strong at the time, but it was not about apartheid. Though the Dutch were there, and the Dutch were very angry about apartheid, and Afrikaans is a dialect of Dutch. So the Dutch would manage in the question period to insert apartheid. Professor van der Werve, I very much enjoyed your talk, but I wonder how that relates to the apartheid that we saw. You know, the Afrikaners were very angry. So finally, they consented to have a late evening session devoted entirely to apartheid. And then the so-called coloreds and blacks in South Africa spoke up. And they spoke up with this incredibly powerful and plainful call for justice. The Afrikaners said justice, not the issue. We're really kind, benevolent people. But I felt that I'd been called by God to speak up for these people. Not becoming an activist, but in my life as a philosopher. So I put a justice on my agenda. Then 2.5 years later, I attended a conference on Palestinian human rights on the west side of Chicago. And the same thing happened. These Palestinians, most of them Christian, issued a call for justice. So second time. And then two more, may I have about 2 more minutes? Then 2 more episodes. Third, there's an organization called Association for Justice in Honduras. I went down to Honduras and once again visited the poor, just underprivileged people that the association was serving. But maybe the most moving thing was this. Calvin College, where I had taught, is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In Ionia, 50 miles to the east, there's a state prison for men, high security. Calvin began what I call the Calvin Prison Initiative, whereby it gives 30 students a year courses for an AB. I went there a few times. It was the most each time has been the most incredibly moving experience in my life. And what I've learned is how these guys in prison are daily demeaned. You can't imagine the ways in which they are demeaned. And this education being offered by Calvin represents an alternative to being demeaned. So Bethan, in my case, it was not reading what other philosophers had written about justice. It was experiential. And I generalize rightly or wrongly from that. I think for people to get moved about issues of justice, most of us have to actually see the faces and hear the voices of the victims. I don't think for most of us, print in newspapers does it, maybe for a few. But that's how, I think of it as God, that's how God placed justice on my agenda.
kind of empathy that's evoked in you, and that relational element to justice, which lies at the heart, I think, of everything that you say about what justice is. It's always got this relational element at its heart. So I wonder if you can unpack a little bit for those who are listening today, how you approach this theology brief, which kind of encapsulates all of your thinking, I think, on justice over a long period of time, and particularly how you began to think about the biblical roots of justice and the distinctives of Christian justice, as opposed to other, perhaps secular or other conceptions of what justice is. So can you talk to us about that biblical conception of justice?
Sure. When I began thinking about justice, I scoured around in the Western literature, came across a definition by the late Roman jurist Ulpian: justice is rendering to each their right or due. In Latin, justice is rendering to each their use. Now, we don't have that play in English, but, and then that definition goes into the great code established by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. And Justinian leads off, or his lawyers lead off, with Ulpian's definition: justice is rendering to each their right or due. And that goes into the Western tradition. And there's some disagreement with it here and there, but that's basically how the West has thought about justice. So, but the big issue then is what I call the contours of justice. Yes, okay, there's that abstract description, but can we flesh it out? And that I see is where Scripture presents us with a very distinct take on justice. Plato's Republic, ancient philosopher Plato, is about justice, but what Plato says about justice is profoundly different from what Isaiah and Amos say about justice. Here are some of the distinctives of biblical justice. First, God is a God of justice. And God says, do justice like unto me. So the Christian understands himself, herself, when doing justice as imitating God. Another very striking feature of how justice gets discussed in Scripture is that there's a constant emphasis on what I call the widows, the quartet of the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the impoverished. Over and over in the Old Testament, they have priority. Well, wealthy people can get mugged on the road, sure, but it's the quartet of the vulnerable that has priority. And that extends into the New Testament, where especially prisoners get added. So it becomes a quartet of the vulnerable. That, I think, is of fundamental importance for Christians. When we care about justice, look first at the little ones, the overlooked ones, the vulnerable ones. A third distinctive of justice in Scripture is that over and over it's tied in with shalom. Shalom is flourishing. People experience shalom when they flourish in all kinds of different ways. And what comes through in the Old Testament is that there cannot be genuine shalom, genuine flourishing, in the absence of justice. We're all aware of the fact that the slave owners in the U.S. South often claim that their slaves were happy. And for all I know, some of them were. But happy or not, they were being treated unjustly, and shalom was not present. So biblical shalom is more than just feeling good. It's being rightly treated. I'll add one more thing. Another feature of rights and justice in Scripture is that one of the fundamental responsibilities of government is justice. Psalm 72, render justice, Romans 13. There's a book by Republican Justice by, I can't think of his name now, which reviews what evangelical leaders have said about justice for the past century. And what strikes you is that they hardly ever talk about justice. individual liberty. And so that becomes the evangelical credo for social action. Scripture is not against biblical liberty, but I put it like this sometimes: liberty in the absence of justice is liberty for the lions and the eagles of the world. So those are some of the distinctives of justice and rights in Scripture.
That does bring us quite neatly to that kind of question that I would just like to unpack a little more around why rights. So I think you've begun to tell us why rights, because it's about that preferential option for the quartet of the vulnerable, potentially. But this is slightly controversial, potentially, isn't it? You focus on the language of rights, and some would push back against that and say that that promotes or perpetuates individualistic tendencies. Can you just tell us a little bit more about why you favoured that language of rights?
Yeah, two points. First, running throughout Scripture, from the opening chapters of Genesis, is this theme of the worth or the dignity of human beings. We bear the ultimate worth of being created in the image of God. And fundamentally, rights consist of paying due honor to the other person's or to your own worth. So justice and rights are sort of right there in front of us when Scripture talks about dignity. What's emerged in relatively recent years as a line of thought by Christian theologians, secularists alike, that rights talk began in the secular Enlightenment of the 18th century as part of a philosophy of possessive individualism, and we ought to turn away from it. First is this: yes, rights talk can be used to claim my rights, but rights talk also pertains to the right of the other person. Rights are symmetrical. When you and I come into each other's presence, I have rights vis-a-vis you, and you have rights vis-a-vis me. So it's just a deep distortion of the idea of rights to just focus on your own rights. Just as it's a distortion of the notion of obligation, to always focus on your obligations and not to talk about mine. And let me say one word, I'm talking too long, about the history of the idea of natural rights. This idea that it began in the Enlightenment, it's nonsense. There's a terrific legal historian at Emory University in Atlanta, John Whitty, who has traced rights back into history with extreme detail. What he points out is that the theologians and the philosophers who say it began in the Enlightenment are only looking at what philosophers said. Whitty looks at what the jurists said and the legal theorists said. And then he finds rights going back into the Middle Ages and into ancient antiquity and into the commenters on the Talmud. Argues that from the very beginning has been a crucial part of the Reformed Presbyterian tradition of Christianity. So rights is a Christian inheritance. It's not the invention of some secular Enlightenment guys.
So I think you've given us a flavour of why justice is so important, both biblically and within kind of Christian tradition there. And I wonder if we can turn now just to think a little bit about why you think Christian scholars today need to be particularly alert to questions of justice, both within their scholarly work and within the academy. What are some of those questions of justice, and why would you encourage other scholars, Christian scholars, to be particularly focused on these questions of justice in their fields?
Fundamental reason for caring about justice is that our fellow human beings have worth. And that's just an abstract idea unless we honor that worth, pay attention to that worth. That idea that we bear worth seems to me so deep in the Christian message. So that's what I'd first of all say. Plato has a totally different idea of justice. Justice is everybody doing what they're good at. You can be doing what you're good at and be treating the people around you with total injustice. In the university, I see two basic places for being alert to justice. One, in some disciplines, where you're dealing with how human beings act, economics, art, and so forth. We should pay attention to how in those areas of life we treat each other justly or unjustly. Even in a field like art, for example, to make art available only to the well-to-do and let other people just live in aesthetic squalor is a matter of injustice. But also I've come to be alert to the fact that inside the academy, justice is important. Let's face it, I've seen countless examples of older profs putting down younger profs because they felt that they were being challenged, competed, and so forth. I've seen profs putting down students. So there's a lot of injustice in how the academy goes about its business. Who gets to appear in journals and who does not get to appear in journals.
That's right. Yeah, and some of those questions I think will be unpacked by the panel further as they bring those different disciplinary perspectives to this question. I wonder, just as a final question, whether you could just offer a brief comment on what you found valuable about this particular book, putting your theology brief out there and getting those interdisciplinary responses. How have you seen that as kind of valuable or important activity to be involved in?
What I found valuable is, well, for one thing, that initial theology brief by myself. People, I don't recall anybody criticizing what I said, but I may have just blotted that out. What they asked for is, explain a little further. This, what you said is a little bit cryptic and so forth. So I found that valuable. But also what I found really valuable is people highlighting the role of justice in areas where I never thought about justice. Here's one. I feel almost silly now. There's a wonderful essay in the book about justice and language. How often it happens that we tell a certain group of people, don't talk like that, and so forth. The schools for Indigenous Americans in North America, telling these Indian kids that they could only speak English, they could not speak their native language. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that it just never occurred to me, but language is not just the content of language, but the very type of language that you're used and not allowed to use has justice considerations. I found that's just one example of my experience of reading through it, saying, wow, I never thought of that.
It's an incredible range of responses, isn't it? And I think for everybody who delves into it, you will find that there are issues of justice that you'd never thought of before. One of them for me particularly was space architecture, which I think we're going to hear a little bit more about now from Daniel Hastings.
Justice and architecture. I come from a family of woodworkers and carpenters, and so justice and architecture and injustice in architecture. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. There are just, it's opening up whole new areas of thought. And I think that's what we're going to do now as I pass back to Terry. But thank you so much, Nicholas, for that wonderful explanation of the theology brief and your thinking around justice.
Thank you, Bethan. Thank you, Professor Wolterstorff. And let's indeed now move to some of those exciting areas with our distinguished panel of scholars who are contributors in this book. Professor Cecilia Jacob from Australia, Professor Daniel Hastings from the US, although he's presently in Sydney, Professor Dinesha Samararatne from Sri Lanka, and Professor K.K. Yeo from the US. Professor Jacob, may I begin with you? You're an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School in the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University, where you have also served as Associate Dean for Research engagement, and impact. Your academic journey has taken you from the Sorbonne in Paris to Canberra and Australia. You're a specialist in mass atrocities, and you've done extensive field work on widespread civil violence within countries in Asia and the Pacific. Is your choice to work on this academic agenda influenced by your faith, and more particularly by a Christian understanding of justice?
Thank you so much, Professor Halliday. And I'd just like to start by thanking you for having me on this panel and thanking Professor Wolterstorff for this brilliant opportunity to engage with your work. Yes, 100% has my Christian worldview, informed the work that I do. I think my very interest in international relations was informed by my Christian worldview. I think being very aware of the deep injustices. I was from a very young age, and that's what led me to study international relations in the first place. But I think over time I've become much more explicit, or really thought through my own intellectual commitments in my field of international relations, having gone through academic study where we don't engage with theological questions when we're talking about questions of war and mass atrocities and injustice. So, this kind of a project has been very helpful to be also explicit in my mind about those relationships. But, I think more broadly in my field of international relations, we are reckoning with many historical injustices, whether they're questions of colonialism or slavery and Indigenous rights. We're looking around the world at mass atrocities taking place in conflicts, and it's very visible to us. So I think it's very important to be able to articulate a Christian worldview in this space, particularly given the fact that when entering into a conversation where there are many voices that have a lot to say about these particular matters. So we do need to be explicit and to think through those connections. So I think there is a fundamental relationship between the work that I do with experience, as Professor Wolterstorff had said, with the academic and intellectual exercises behind it.
On your GFI podcast, which for listeners is available on Spotify and Apple, and in this book, you speak about moving beyond your academic writings on atrocities to active public policy interventions on hate speech and the terrible harms that can follow. What form has that taken?
Yes, so this particular example was a collaboration between a number of scholars and civil society activists across the Asia-Pacific region, and we published in 2021 this a major policy report on combating hate speech and mitigating incitement to violence that could lead to atrocities. And that was incredibly enriching to be able to work with collaborators across the region to, study very closely the kinds of academic questions that we look at around, what drives conflict, what are the fundamental grievances and injustices within a society, but how these translate through contemporary social media and technology, and then the physical manifestation of violence that can lead from that. And we also traced a number of cases where it is, possible to mitigate incitement to violence through whether it's social media, legal reform, political interventions, and so on. And we were able to publish and to present this to government audiences across the globe, actually, as well as dedicated workshops within the region. And so I think this is a big part of the academic enterprise, is moving between the real world injustices that we confront in our academic research, and to be able to translate that back into, real world action.
Thank you. Can we now turn to Professor Hastings to pursue this line of thought, because you're a physicist by training and currently Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You served as chief scientist of the U.S. Air Force and on many national level boards, including NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration, which many of us hear so much about. I remember being startled at a meeting that you and I had in your MIT office as the dialogue on justice got away. You said that space-based communications, as Bethan has just said, your specialty, you said this is a big justice issue. And in this book, you write that global space-based systems such as GPS and Elon Musk's Starlink, which provide worldwide internet services, raise profound issues of justice. Could you tell us why?
Terry, this goes directly to what Professor Wolterstorff said about flourishing. Let me just change the conversation a little bit and say, one of the great accomplishments of engineering in the last century was figuring out how to provide clean water to large populations. Now, it's clearly not the case that clean water is everywhere in the world, but in many parts of the world now, people can get clean water. And if you just look historically, that was just not the case. So that, I would say, is now a basic issue of justice because it allows human beings to flourish. Now, in the same way, in the latter part of the last century, the U.S. Air Force ended up providing GPS services for free to the world. Although if you look at the historical documents, it was pretty apparent they didn't completely appreciate what they were doing when they did that, right? But having said that, the ability now to know one's precise position and time on the surface of the globe allows us as human beings and as societies to flourish in ways that we could not actually do before. I mean, it allows for better agriculture. I mean, it allows you to find a restaurant you're looking for. It allows a whole bunch of different things like that. Now, and what's occurring now, of course, is that companies, and now in particular SpaceX has started that, has been putting up the Starlink constellation, which will provide worldwide internet access to anybody. Now, when GPS was done, it was done by the government, whose primary reason for doing it, of course, was military, and they did the civilian stuff as a kind of an adjunct, not completely appreciating how big it would get. Starlink is a different category. It's a private company that is providing that service, and I've argued that again, in the principle of helping human flourishing, that such a capability should be made available to all, either for nothing or at very low cost, because it provides so much to actually help us actually flourish. I mean, that's actually my thinking in the context of what Professor Wolterstorff said.
And so in these rights issues about who controls technologies like GPS and internet access, in the book you speak about the relative merits of government control of these technologies versus control by private businesses. How do you think about that?
Well, I want to be clear. I'm not against private businesses controlling things, but of course, if it's a monopoly, then what happens is they have no incentive to control their costs because they can charge whatever they want, and as Professor Wolterstorff said it about us, then only the rich will be able to actually benefit. So, government, which is in the business of pursuing justice for all, as he said, can provide something at its basic cost. Now, if the government cannot do that or will not do it, what I would say is what we need is strong competition in the private sector. I mean, so I'm all in favor of that. Strong competition in the private sector so that each of the private actors is incentivized to keep their costs as low as possible, so that again, human flourishing can actually occur. So either one is fine with me, as long as what's happening is that the benefit is spread broadly and the vast majority of people can actually access the benefit.
And so this brings us back to justice and institutions. and leads readily to Professor Samararatne. You are a professor of law at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. After you graduated in law from the University of Colombo, you did a master's degree at Harvard and later had an academic appointment at the University of Melbourne in Australia. You are also a member of Sri Lanka's Constitutional Council, whose members include the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the Speaker of Parliament, and members nominated by them. So Professor Wolterstorff proposes a concept of first-order justice, that a biblical theory of justice compels us to seek justice in every institution in society. Does a focus on rights feature in one of your primary fields of research and writing?
Thanks, Terry, for the question. And thanks also for having me on this webinar. So there are three areas in which I think I consider myself as having a primary role: research, teaching, and because of this part-time public office I holding public office. In all three, I think rights and concern for rights is core to what I do. But of course, in law, one would argue that rights ought to have a significant role, because regardless of whether you think of rights in the sense that Professor Wolterstorff spoke of it, the law is always determining our rights and obligations. But as far as I'm concerned, because of my faith and because I believe that humankind is made in the image of God, I'm always, whether it's research, whether it's teaching, or whether I'm part of a decision-making body like the Constitutional Council, I'm always thinking of how the law affects the image of God in us. And over the last 3 years, what I've experienced in particular is that research, teaching, and when you do engage, like I do by contributing to public decision-making, all three inform each other. So in many ways, I think academics are uniquely placed to contribute to the making of theory, to engage with the next generation and ask questions which either have been asked before or ask new questions, and then push ourselves to apply these theories and ask these questions in actual decision making. So for me, it's a given that the commitment to rights has to inform all these things that I do.
In the Justice and Rights book, and also in your GFI podcast, you write that there is injustice in the heart of the global academy and the relationship of scholars and universities in the global south and the global north. What does that injustice look like?
So there are three areas in which I see this in very sort of troubling ways. One is, I would say, methodologically and perhaps normatively. In my own field and in the adjacent fields, for a long time, the making of theory or the development of theory has been informed by what we call the usual suspects. The more dominant case studies, like in the global north. So theory is formed by studying those case studies by leading scholars and universities in those regions. And then that theory is carried forward to places like Sri Lanka and other places in the global south. So the development of theory, the development of doctrine and institutional design is overwhelmingly informed by what we've been describing as an Eurocentric approach. Second, the development of scholarly communities. And this, again, you can look at it from a normative perspective, but also at a very practical level. Today, for instance, I had to hand in a visa application because I'm wanting to travel to London. And the amount of time and energy and resources it takes is a reminder that ultimately there is severe inequality in academia from a global perspective. And academic resources. So when I responded to Professor Wolterstorff's brief, I made the point that I didn't have access to almost all the books that he was referring to, simply because much of academia in the world doesn't really have access to the best theoretical work that is published by the best thinkers of our time. So there are those financial, physical, and institutional inequalities as well. And finally, publication. If you want to publish in academically robust journals, publish with academic publishing houses, the standard is very high. But if you're working in places like I do, where there are so many constraints, there are institutional issues that one has to deal with, it is almost impossible to publish in that way. So even when it comes to academic publication, which is a core aspect of academic work, I see these injustices. So there are these three main areas in which I'm constantly grappling with this quest.
Thank you. Let us now turn to Professor Yeo, co-editor of this volume. Professor Yeo, you grew up in Malaysian Borneo, not too far on the globe from my homeland of New Zealand. You're currently Professor Emeritus of New Testament and the author and editor of many books in English and Chinese, including the 5-part series on cross-cultural theology with Edmonds and InterVarsity Press. Your 800-page Oxford Handbook on the Bible in China, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, is a landmark for Christianity in China. So you're a co-editor of our book, the first in this series, and we write in the preface that the book is unlike any other that we've edited before. Could you just say a little bit more about that? What does make it different in your view?
Thank you, Dr. Halliday. I mean, it's a joy to co-edit this series with you. I think the GFI project stands out because of the quality conversations among scholars. I myself, I've been benefited from that. First, our method, I think, is cross-disciplinary and therefore reflect how GFI scholars engage, for example, in regional groups with thoughtful exchanges that conveners and editors would help draw it out, and then ultimately bringing out the best in each author's work. Secondly, what is special about this series is that the genre is really unique. When you intentionally bring theologians and disciplinary scholars together in this volume under Professor Wolterstorff's leadership, and then each contributor intentionally distill their expertise around the theme of justice within their own field. That makes the book a model of very concise and precise scholarship, speaks to both writers and readers who are so busy today. And lastly, I would say the series kind of publishing style with Langham here. I mean, we try to capture the rich and multi-layer dialogues. So both the print and the ebook formats with Langham Publishing, the index, for example, I mean, they are not just a traditional dictionary style kind of tool, but both the subject and the scripture indexes are actually study guides, repackaged, study guides in a cluster kind of groupings with strong cross references, because we try to promote the kind of dialogue going on. So our hope is that this series would really support and sustain meaningful conversations about transformative justice in our lives, especially in the university campuses.
Could we turn to the many years of teaching that you did at Peking University, where you taught and trained hundreds of students and Christian leaders in China's churches? Is justice, is giving others their due, as Professor Wolterstorff defines it, an issue for the Chinese church?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's the pertinent kind of issue because of the context. What I find is that the Chinese church in this case practices biblical justice, or understood in this case as giving others the due in the sight of God. That's the Christian reflection they want to do. But I can't stop there. That Christian reflection needs to be done in the kind of context. So there is a creative tension with traditional and modern China today, which is shaped by the Confucianist kind of values. So what my essay is trying to show in this case is how the idea of justice developed across cultures, from Old Testament Jewish context into New Testament Hellenistic Jewish world, and then I push it, of course, justice in the Confucianist kind of China. So I can think of maybe 3 practical ways these Chinese churches keep pushing forward justice despite walking in a very narrow, sometimes red lines. Number 1 is fostering social harmony through active Christian faith. The work of Amity's Foundation, for example, with the poor in a rural area, a strong kind of a Christian foundation. Secondly, they would prioritize care in close relationship of Confucian's justice. That's how Confucians would understand what justice would be. So Chinese Christians, business people, entrepreneurs would support orphanages, adoption of young girls. That's very countercultural, right? For the traditional Chinese society. And lastly, they would advocate fairness and human rights through legal teams, legal councils, even when facing government restrictions on prophetic action.
Thank you, and thank you to each of the panelists. We've received some thoughtful questions from registrants to the webinar. So let me turn the webinar back to Dr. Willis.
Thank you. So yes, I'm just going to pose to the panelists some of the questions that have come in advance from those attending today. So I think I'll begin with a question around nationalism. And the question is, how does Professor Wolterstorff's theological grounding for rights provide a robust counter-narrative to the rise of nationalism in our fragmented world? I wonder, Professor Wolterstorff, if you'd like to tackle that question first, and if anyone else would like to contribute, that would be welcome.
Tackle is probably the right word. It's a big one.
Yeah.
So I take nationalism to be this: when one party within a state wants to make the state its own in one way or another. For example, the Afrikaners wanted, talked very explicitly about an African Christian state. A lot of Israelis talk about Israel. In fact, most of them, I suppose, talk about Israel as a Jewish state. And that can take various forms. But so also in the US, when a nationalist wants the US to be in some form a Christian state, and that can take many forms. One form was recently the director of education in Oklahoma ordered that the Bible had to be taught in all public schools. Now, I would find this frightening in any case. Do you really want secular people to be teaching the Bible? Do you really want that? But in any case, that's certainly a way in which Oklahoma wants Oklahoma to be Christian. So I take religious nationalism always in one form or another to want the state to favor them in some way. And whenever that happens, the non-favored people are being treated unjustly. That's just the nature of the case. It's the nationalist is not asking how we can all live together in justice, but is asking how can we make the U.S. a Christian nation, or whatever. That's my initial take on it. It's inherently unjust.
I can ask a different question from someone who is living in Burundi, I think, a Burundian living in a region prone to recurrent conflicts. They say they've witnessed outbreaks of violence approximately every 5 years in one of the neighboring countries. And I think the question that they're really asking is, how can they, as a Christian, live in a place where, violent injustice is a ever-present reality. I wonder if, Cecilia, you might have anything to say to that from your work.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's so important to be asking these questions. And, you know, we live in a broken world. Sadly, there's not going to be perfect institutions and perfect outcomes. But I think as Christians, we have hope. And we have hope that the places where we have influence and we're able to shape outcomes, that, you know, we can be used in those places. So I think it's very important to think about how we can extend our theoretical understandings of justice to real world action. I often have students coming to me at the end, you know, I teach a semester on humanitarianism, and at the end they ask about careers, you know, what can I do, you know, this anxiety of, you know, how can I fix these problems? And I often say to students, you know, there's never going to be one job or one place where you'll be able to influence everything. We know that, whether it's, you know, in government or in international organizations, but let's think about faith communities, let's think about societies. There will never be one place that will have all the answers and the solutions, but put yourself in a place where you're going to have impact, right? And so I think then being explicit about, you know, what we're seeking as biblical justice. In my own intervention to this book, I dwelt on this understanding of justice as reconciliation, as right relationship. And we can think about, you know, as Christians, we have that right relationship restored between us and God. And I argue that, you know, there are deep insights for how we can extend this to conflicts elsewhere. And so thinking about peace building as restoring right relationships, as reconciliation, as healing brokenness, that justice is not just accountability in terms of retribution or criminal accountability, even though that's important, but it's something much deeper than that. So I would just encourage you to continue on your pursuit of faith and your pursuit of peace and justice that flows from it.
Thank you so much. I think in a similar vein, perhaps another question is around Palestine and Gaza. And I'd welcome any panelists to respond to this. The question is, what rights and justice do Palestinians in Gaza currently have? Can the rest of the world do anything to protect the innocents in Gaza under international humanitarian law? So I wonder if there are any comments from the panel on those. Professor Wolterstorff, do you want to make a comment on that to begin, perhaps?
Yeah, I feel strongly about it, having defended the cause of the Palestinians, well, since I first became acquainted with them at that meeting in spring of '78. Their rights are being trampled on, severely trampled on. And what can we do? I fear the US, in its current political situation, is going to do nothing, or worse than that, it's going to encourage the continuation of the devastation of Gaza. It's an enormous, can't find the right words for it, it's an enormous trampling on rights. The original Hamas attack was horrible, trampled on the rights of the Israelis, and the response was multiply horrible. My country is enabling it.
Thank you. I wonder if there's any, perhaps Dinesha, if you're still with us, whether there is anything particular around the kind of the legal questions that this might raise.
Thinking of which aspect to respond to, Bethan, because this is really a question of our times, and what we do and say in response has consequences wherever we are, I think. So a couple of things. I think the law is clear. This is really not a question about whether we have the legal concepts or principles or institutions. It's a question of what we choose to do. And as Professor Wolterstorff said, different people are making different choices, and we all feel very strongly about those choices. It is tragic that ultimately life can be seen as consequentialist. We attach different values to lives, we deny truths, and it's often very easy to just throw our hands up and say, look, what can I do? This is an overwhelming situation. So a couple of things that I have, I mean, these are all, I think, incomplete responses. One is, I think, for some of us, it's easy to wring our hands about the Palestinian question and ignore similar questions in our own immediate context. I think that's a problem. Second, I think we have to look at our spheres of influence and ask ourselves, how do we live in those places, use the influence that we have in a way that is relevant to this Palestinian question. And that, I think, looks different for each of us, but those are two sort of slightly open-ended, but those are the two responses that I try to work with when it comes to this issue.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for those thoughtful responses. And now I think Professor Terry Halliday will close our time together.
Thank you to Professor Wolterstorff and Dr. Willis, and to each of the panelists who've written wonderful sections in this book. I urge you to buy the book and to explore all of the new things that it might reveal, just as Professor Wolterstorff himself experienced. 45 scholars wrote in this book, and they came away with new ideas for themselves. They came away with new colleagues in the global church, as that church is represented in the university, and indeed with new thought for students, for faculty, and the church as a whole. I can't help but saying the price is low, and Langham delivers with free delivery anywhere in the world, print and, of course, e-print versions that may be downloaded on many different platforms. Thank you to all participants, and thank you to all of you in our global audience for joining us.